Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, by Bruce L. Shelley. Chapter 22. A Song to Lady Poverty, Francis and the Apostolic Lifestyle. Everyone we know loves a lover. Songs of endless devotion are not new. The ballads of the troubadours filled the 12th century. They were all about courtly love, gallant knights, sinister magicians, enchanted castles, talking animals, and always beautiful damsels. Perhaps that is why so many felt drawn to St. Francis of Assisi. His song was of Lady Poverty, his ideal for true Christianity and personal holiness. Early in his preaching career, Christ's very courageous knight, as his first biographer called him, gave himself devotedly, ardently to poverty. According to one of many stories told about him, Francis, with some companions, went out in search of poverty. Two old men told Francis that she lived high in the mountains. Scaling the peaks, Francis found her there on the throne of her neediness. She welcomed the travelers, and Francis immediately praised her as the Queen of the Virtues. She replied that she had indeed been with Adam in paradise, but after he sinned she had become a homeless wanderer. Then Jesus came. He made her his elect one, and through her believers multiplied. Monks especially joined her until her enemy avarice made them rich and worldly. Then she no longer had a choice. She withdrew from monasticism. Upon hearing Poverty's story, Francis vowed to be faithful to her. He took her as his bride, and she descended the mountain with him. Francis was not the only spiritual knight devoted to Lady Poverty. In 12th and 13th centuries, she had a host of admirers. Itinerant preaching and voluntary poverty appealed to the imagination and conscience of many Christians. Growing numbers of laymen, instead of relying on the prayers of monks and bishops, read the Bible in the vernacular and vowed to follow the gospel mandate. Sell what you have, give to the poor, and come, follow me. Some of these believers chose orthodoxy, others opted for heresy, and at times only a knife's edge seemed to separate the two. One thing was clear. Innocent III's vision of the ascended Christ who ruled through his viceroy all nations, all learning, and all grace in this life and the next faced a formidable rival in the ancient image of the Savior, who said, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Where, after all, is true Christianity? In a sacramental institution or in a self-denying lifestyle? Poverty, heresy, and violence. The medieval poverty movement is a timeless reminder that political Christianity is only partial Christianity. The Christian faith is more than papal policy, much more. What shall it profit the Church, to paraphrase Jesus, to gain the world and lose their soul? What advantage are canon laws, holy crusades, episcopal appointments, and scholastic disputations if common people receive a stone when asking for bread? The gospel of voluntary poverty drew its strength from a deep and widespread resentment of a corrupt and neglectful priesthood. The Back to the Apostles movement was often allied with political and economic restlessness in a rapidly changing and expanding society. But as its heart was people's spiritual hunger, at a time When it was desperately needed, pastoral care was a lost art. Robert Grosseteste, the able Bishop of Lincoln, England, 1235 to 53, declared the covetousness, greed, and immorality of the clergy. As the life of pastors is the book of the laddie, it is manifest that such as these are the preachers of all errors and wickedness. And the foundation of all of this, said Grosseteste, is the Roman court. It appoints not pastors, but destroyers of people. Grosseteste's complaint had a familiar ring to it. As early as the 10th century, monastic reformers had called for a return to the poverty of the early church. Every zealous preacher knew that if apostolic poverty is the Christian ideal, then bishops in their embellished palaces and monks in their wealthy cloisters were not living the Christian life. In early centuries, however, all such appeals to sacrifice were conveniently channeled into some new monastic reform. Within the church itself, it was business as usual. The 12th and 13th centuries proved to be different. Not all preachers of apostolic poverty were willing to remain within the acceptable boundaries of the church. When they turned against the church, they entered the ranks of heretics. Modern Western Christians find it all but impossible to understand the medieval attitude toward heresy. We assume that religious faith is a matter of personal choice, but we seldom think of doctrine and religious beliefs as life and death matters. Why should anyone either die for their own faith or kill another for theirs? Medieval Christians, however, never considered faith strictly private. Christian beliefs were the cement of society. Denying a doctrine was tantamount to treason. Christendom was, to shift the image, a socio-political body, and the Christian faith was its life-giving soul. So heresy in Christendom was no more acceptable than cancer in the flesh. But what is heresy? In the 12th century, it was the denial, by a baptized person, of any revealed truth of the Christian faith. Among these truths were the unity of the Church and the divine appointment of the Pope as head of the Christian body. Therefore, disobedience to established authority was itself heresy. In dealing with heretics, then, the Church had two primary objectives. First, the conversion of the heretic, and second, the protection of Christian society. But how far can the Church go to protect society? Is it right to take a life to protect other lives? Heresy drove the Catholic Church to her most serious. How can the Church employ violence to safeguard a peaceful society? The Church deliberately accepted a line of action all but impossible to reconcile with the eternal kingdom toward which she aspired. She created the Inquisition, not only to execute heretics, but to subject them to deliberate and prolonged torture. In driving out one devil, the Church opened the door for 7 others. The contradiction was not widely apparent at the time. The same Church that sent crusading armies against the infidels could command the burning of heretics. Almost everyone agreed that a pure Church was the will of God. The poor in the kingdom. But where is the one pure Church? Is it in the papal palace in Rome? Is it in the blood of crusading armies, or in the sale of indulgences to the poor? What if the one pure Church is in none of these, but in the hungry who find bread, the naked who are clothed, and the stranger who finds rest? What if the kingdom of heaven does belong to the poor in spirit? That was the question Lady Poverty raised. One of the earliest voices against the worldliness of the Catholic Church was Arnold, an abbot at Brescia, a town in northern Italy. In a series of sermons there, Arnold insisted that clerical vice was a result of the Church's attempt to control the world. He urged the Church to surrender its property and secular dominion to the state and return to the poverty and simplicity of the early church. The true church and its ministers, he said, should shun wealth, for wealth and power nullify salvation. By 1139, Arnold succeeded in turning the people against their bishop. For this, the Pope, Innocent II, banished Arnold from Italy. He apparently fled to Paris, where he studied under Abelard and aroused the wrath of Bernard of Clairvaux. Just as his teacher had succeeded in doing, another ravening wolf in sheep's clothing, Bernard called him. After 5 years in exile, Arnold showed up in Rome and immediately joined a movement to overthrow papal dominion. The Romans, filled with dreams of the ancient Roman Republic, seized power during the Pope's preaching tour for the Second Crusade, and Arnold stepped into leadership of the new purely secular government. He preached that clergy should live in apostolic poverty, and he denounced the College of Cardinals as a den of thieves. The experiment lasted about 10 years before Pope Hadrian IV placed Rome under an interdict and secured the help of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in capturing Arnold. In 1155 he was executed by burning, and his ashes were thrown into the Tiber River. People had scarcely forgotten Arnold when another voice for poverty arose in eastern France, Peter Waldo, 1140 to 1218, a rich merchant of Lyons. One day, Waldo heard a wandering troubadour sing the virtues of the monastic life. The ballad was about young Alexis, whose patrician Roman parents pressed him into marriage. The reluctant groom, however, was dedicated to the ideal of chastity. So on his wedding night he made a pact of virgin purity with his bride, and immediately left for the Holy Land. Alexis's parents searched for him in vain. Years later he returned home a beggar, so emaciated from his life of self-denial that no one recognized him. He existed in the courtyard on scraps from the family table. Only as he lay dying did he reveal his true identity, too late for the grieving family to claim him. The moral was pointed. A true Christian must be willing to sacrifice everything in his life for the sake of the next. Struck to the heart by the story, Waldo sought a priest to find out how to live like Christ. The priest turned him to the answer Jesus gave to the rich young ruler. If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. Matthew 19:21. The same text, 9 centuries before, had launched a monastic movement with Anthony in Egypt. Waldo decided to follow the counsel. He provided an adequate income for his wife, placed his 2 daughters in a cloister, and gave the rest to his estate to the poor. To launch his mission to the poor, Waldo enlisted 2 priests to translate portions of the Bible into French. After memorizing long passages, Waldo began to teach common folk to imitate Christ by practicing voluntary poverty. Thus, his innovations lay in applying the life of poverty, discipleship, and preaching to all true Christians, not just monks. As he gained a few followers, Waldo sent them out 2 by 2, after the apostolic pattern, to villages and marketplaces to teach and explain the Scriptures. They called themselves the poor in spirit. We know them as Waldensians. Waldo's unauthorized preaching soon met the stiff opposition of the Archbishop of Lyon, who ordered him to stop. Waldo refused, quoting St. Peter, "We must obey God rather than human beings," Acts 5:29. The Archbishop excommunicated him. Waldo and his followers decided to appeal to the Pope. They arrived in Rome and found it crowded with church officials attending the Third Lateran Council, 1179. They were able to gain a hearing before the council, but had the misfortune to be ridiculed by a smooth, fast-talking Englishman named Walter Map. Pope Alexander III found no evidence of heresy among them, and was impressed by their poverty. They were mere laymen, however, not ordained, so he ruled that they could preach only by the invitation of bishops, an unlikely prospect. Waldo was convinced that the Scriptures commanded him to preach to the poor with or without bishop's approval. Along with a growing number of followers, he continued to preach and practice apostolic poverty. The movement spread into southern France and across the Alps into Italy. By 1184, their disobedience compelled Pope Lucius III to excommunicate them from the Holy Catholic Church. The conflict is understandable. The Waldensians wanted to purify the Church by a return to the simple life of the apostles. This meant the surrender of worldly power. Their aim, like that of the Roman Church, was salvation. But their means were radically different. The papacy could not renounce its sacraments or its priesthood, nor admit that faith in God might be something other than the mandates of Rome. From their side, the Waldensians came to believe more and more that no teaching except Christ's was binding. The Scriptures must rule, but how could they find support for their cause if everyone lived in apostolic poverty? Slowly they came to accept, just as early monastic houses had, two levels of Christian commitment. The poor in spirit, the society proper, was bound by special vows and worshipped together in simple services. Another circle of friends remained in the Catholic Church, but supplied recruits and support for the movement. Waldensians were so clearly a back-to-the-Bible movement that over the years many evangelical Christians have tried to present them as reformers before the Reformation. Compared with the Roman Church's doctrine of papal authority, the Waldensians' call to a return to the Bible does indeed sound like Luther or Calvin, but their view of salvation, a life of penance and poverty, lacks the clear note of God's grace that sounded so powerfully in the Reformation. The peril of two heresies. A third dissenting movement, and by far the most troublesome for the Catholic Church, was the group commonly called Cathari, which means pure ones. Since they were especially influential around the town of Albi in southern France, some people called them Albigenses. Most of what we know about the Albigenses comes through their enemies, and as Charles Williams once observed, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted and state accurately what one's opponent says, much less what he thinks. Very likely, however, the Cathari infiltrated Europe from Bulgaria, where one of their chief branches bore the name Bogomilis. Like the Gnostics in the early church, the Cathari held that the universe is the scene of an eternal conflict between two powers, the one good, the other evil. Matter, including the human body, is the work of this evil power, the God of the Old Testament. He had, they claimed, imprisoned the human soul in its earthly body. To escape from the power of the flesh, the true Cathar was supposed to avoid marriage, sexual intercourse, the eating of meat, and material possessions. Here was a radical poverty, but one based not so much on the example of Jesus as on the nature of the universe. The cosmic civil war raged between matter and spirit, and the Cathari joined the ranks of the spirit. The good God, they thought, sent Christ to reveal the way of salvation. Christ, to the Cathar, was not a human being but a life-giving spirit. A human Christ was an impossibility. The salvation by death on the cross was unthinkable. Christ taught the way like a Buddha rather than the God-man of Christian creeds. If this description is true, the Cathari were heretical in a way Arnold of Brescia and Peter Waldo were not. Arnold and Waldo refused to submit to church authorities, but the Cathari rejected not only popes and bishops but basic Christianity. They tried to escape from evil not by repentance and faith, but by dividing the self in two. Profiles of Faith. Julian of Norwich, 1342 to 1416, was an English anchoress, a woman who has set herself apart for God and lives isolated in a cell. During a serious illness in which she believed herself to be dying, Julian received a series of 16 revelations, or showings, in which she beheld Christ and saw the meaning of his sufferings. In this life, sin and suffering are needful, she wrote, but Christ promised her that all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Her visions and meditations, recorded in revelations of divine love, serve as a classic of Christian mysticism and are additionally notable for their emphasis on God's maternal nature. The Cathari were in immense peril in the Roman Church. Not only had they revived the ancient dualist heresy by 1200, they had gained the protection of the princes of Toulouse, a cultural area in southern France, and were spreading at an alarming rate. 3 weapons were at the Catholic Church's disposal: preaching to return them to the truth, a crusade to crush all hardened resistance, and the Inquisition to uproot heresy. The rise of the Dominicans. The popes tried sending preachers among the Cathari, but they were notoriously ineffective, at least until a Spaniard named Dominic Guzman, 1170 to 1221, struck upon the reason. In 1206, Dominic was helping in efforts to convert the Albigenses when he realized that the papally assigned preachers were depending on their ecclesiastical pomp and dignity. The Albigenses considered such show a sure sign of false religion. Dominic believed that the heretics would listen if the preachers themselves were committed to poverty. To win the heretics, Dominic went forth among them as a poor man, barefoot and begging. Dominic's peaceful mission lasted only 2 years in southern France before it was forced aside by Innocent III's get-tough policy. However, the zealous Spaniard was convinced that poverty and preaching belonged together. He gathered a group of like-minded men and continued his work among the heretics in other places. In 1220, the Dominican mission and lifestyle gained official approval. The new preaching order that he knew as Dominicans was called mendicants, meaning begging, and the term friar, or brother, distinguished them from monks, because unlike monks they went forth to live among people to preach and teach. Most of monastic houses had once arisen to minister to the countryside, and the mendicant friars now emerged to meet the spiritual needs of townspeople. Meanwhile, Innocent III was determined to crush the Albigensis heresy. The northern French were itching for a chance to gobble up southern France, which was then a separate country. When Innocent called for a crusade, not against the Muslim Turks but against Christian heretics, the northern French came pillaging and murdering. It isn't often the good Christian rulers can save their souls and at the same time enlarge their kingdoms by killing those of deficient doctrine. Even Innocent was shocked by their brutality. But the crusade was eminently successful. By 1215, the Albigenses were uprooted, and Toulouse and the northern French had claimed the ravaged territories of the south. The scattered enter the Inquisitors.